We've decided to restructure the client relations department. Helen, today will be your last day. The words hung in the air of the sleek conference room like an unwelcome odor. I stared at Victor Langston, the new managing partner, who had joined Franklin Consulting Group just 8 months ago. His expression was practiced, a careful blend of corporate regret and detached professionalism. After 25 years. My voice remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. Business decisions aren't personal, Victor replied, sliding a manila folder across the polished table. HR has prepared a severance package, 2 months' salary and continuation of benefits through the end of the quarter. Linda Moore from HR sat beside him, nodding sympathetically while avoiding eye contact. The necessary downside affects several departments, she added. This isn't a reflection on your performance. Wasn't it, though? At 58, I was the oldest employee in client relations. My salary was commensurate with my experience that had helped build Franklin Consulting Group from a scrappy legal consulting firm into an industry leader. Does Edward Franklin know about this? I asked, referring to the founding partner, who had personally hired me 25 years ago. Victor's jaw tightened. All partners were consulted on restructuring decisions. An obvious non-answer. Edward had been in London for the past 3 weeks, negotiating our expansion into the European market. Best of luck in your future endeavors, Victor concluded with a smile that never reached his eyes. Security will escort you to clear out your desk. Standard protocol. I had helped write that protocol 12 years ago. My name is Helen Carter, and until 10 minutes ago, I was the Senior Director of Client Relations at Franklin Consulting Group, one of Boston's premier legal consulting firms. I devoted my career to building relationships with our clients, understanding their needs, anticipating their concerns, ensuring they felt valued beyond the billable hours. In an industry where firms were often seen as interchangeable, I made sure our clients saw us as irreplaceable. Now I was being discarded like an outdated policy manual, with nothing but a manila folder and corporate platitudes to show for a quarter-century of loyalty. As the security guard hovered awkwardly near my desk, I methodically packed my personal items. Photos with clients at charity galas. Thank you notes from the Chambers family after we helped them navigate a complex corporate restructuring. The crystal paperweight Edward had given me on my 20th work anniversary. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Sloan, CEO of Sloan Healthcare, our largest client. Helen, I've heard troubling rumors about changes at FCG. Our quarterly review is next week. Call me ASAP. I looked up to see Victor watching from his office, already on the phone, no doubt spinning damage control. What he didn't understand, what none of them seemed to understand, was that client relationships couldn't be transferred in a memo or reassigned in a database. They were built on trust, consistency, and personal connection. And I had just been severed from 25 years of them. I joined Franklin Consulting Group in 1998, when we occupied half a floor in a modest office building and had exactly 17 clients. Edward Franklin was 42 then, bursting with ambition and determined to create a different kind of consulting firm. Numbers are the language of business, Helen, he told me during my interview. But relationships are its heart. Anyone can crunch numbers. Not everyone can build trust. Over the years, I embodied that philosophy. While others chased promotions through high-profile projects and office politics, I focused on becoming indispensable to our clients. I remembered their children's names, their college choices. I knew which executives wanted technical detail and which preferred big-picture summaries. I tracked leadership changes, company milestones, and strategic pivots so we could anticipate client needs rather than merely react. "You're the relationship architect," Edward once said at my 20th anniversary celebration. You built the foundation that supports everything we do. Things began to change 2 years ago, when outside investors came in to fuel expansion. New partners arrived with polished resumes and aggressive growth strategies. Efficiency metrics began replacing client satisfaction as the primary measure of success. Victor Langston, with his slick presentations and ruthless focus on margins, embodied that shift. Employee turnover rose 40% in less than a year. The unofficial motto changed from clients first to maximum value extraction. I raised concerns in executive meetings. We are sacrificing long-term stability for short-term gains, I warned. The market is changing, Helen, Victor replied dismissively. Adapt or die. Some legacy processes are outdated. Legacy. The word followed me as meeting invitations stopped arriving and key accounts were quietly reassigned. And now, after 25 years, I was gone. The elevator ride down felt longer than it ever had before. Each floor passed in silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of machinery and the faint echo of conversations from offices I would never enter again. When the doors finally opened to the lobby, I stepped out carrying a cardboard box that somehow weighed more than 25 years of work should have. The security guard offered an apologetic nod before returning to his post, already forgetting my face. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass facade of Franklin Consulting Group, dazzling and indifferent. I stood there for a moment, unsure which direction to go. For decades, my schedule had been dictated by client calls, internal meetings, and strategic planning sessions. Now, for the first time in my adult life, there was nothing. My phone buzzed again. Helen, please tell me the rumors aren't true. Margaret Sloan. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to think, something corporate life rarely allowed. Instead, I walked. I passed cafes where junior associates used to gather for rushed lunches. I crossed streets filled with professionals glued to their phones, all convinced their positions were secure. I had once felt that way too. By the time I reached my apartment, dusk had settled in. I placed the box on my dining table and slowly unpacked it. Each item felt like a fragment of a life abruptly interrupted. A framed photo from a charity fundraiser with Rebecca Hall, then a rising executive at Apex Financial. A handwritten card from Michael Reed of Archer Pharma, thanking me for saving our partnership when everything was falling apart. I sat down, exhaustion finally catching up with me. At 7:43 p.m., my phone rang. Margaret Sloan. I answered. Helen, she said without preamble, is it true? Were you let go? Yes. There was a sharp intake of breath. That's unbelievable. You've handled our account since before I became CEO. We were told there was a strategic restructuring, and that Victor Langston would personally oversee client relations going forward. I closed my eyes. That figures. Margaret's voice hardened. Helen, Franklin Consulting Group doesn't have a relationship with Sloan Healthcare. You do. That sentence landed with unexpected force. I didn't encourage her, but I didn't stop her either. Over the next hour, she vented, about delayed responses from Victor's team, about rushed meetings, about junior consultants who didn't understand the complexities of healthcare regulation. We've already had preliminary talks with Blackridge Consulting, she admitted. But I didn't want to move without talking to you first. I ended the call feeling both validated and unsettled. The next morning, my inbox was strangely quiet. No meeting reminders. No internal memos. Just silence, until 9:12 a.m. An email from Rebecca Hall. Heard you left Franklin Consulting Group. Please call me. Then another. Michael Reed. Is it true you're no longer at FCG? We need to talk. By noon, I had spoken to 5 former clients. Each conversation followed the same pattern: disbelief, frustration, and concern. None of them had been consulted. None of them were happy. What they didn't say, but what was painfully clear, was that Franklin Consulting Group had underestimated the depth of the relationships I had built. That afternoon, a message arrived from Edward Franklin. Just landed back in Boston. Heard about the restructuring. Call me. I stared at the screen for a long moment before dialing. Helen, his voice was strained, I didn't authorize this. I believed him. Victor pushed it through while I was abroad, Edward continued. Investors wanted cost reductions. He framed it as a necessary modernization. And you agreed. There was a pause. I didn't realize he meant you. He said senior redundancies. I assumed it was operational staff, not the backbone of our client strategy. I exhaled slowly. Assumptions have consequences. Edward sounded genuinely remorseful. I want to make this right. Come back. We can restructure the restructuring. I thought about Victor's practiced smile. About security escorting me out like a liability. About being told my loyalty was a legacy process. No, Edward. Silence. I've spent my career building trust, I continued. That trust doesn't survive being discarded for a spreadsheet. What will you do? He asked quietly. I didn't know yet. But that night, as I reviewed messages from clients asking where I was headed next, a realization took shape. Franklin Consulting Group hadn't just let me go. They had freed me. The realization that Franklin Consulting Group had freed me rather than broken me didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like morning light filling a dark room. For the first few days after my dismissal, I resisted the urge to immediately plan my next move. For decades, my value had been measured by my calendar, how full it was, how indispensable I appeared. Now, the empty hours felt both unsettling and strangely luxurious. On the fourth morning, I brewed coffee and opened my laptop, not to check internal dashboards or quarterly forecasts, but to review the messages I had carefully archived over the years. Emails. Notes. Holiday cards. Proof of relationships. One message stood out, dated 8 years earlier, from Daniel Brooks of the Boston Business Review. Helen, off the record, FCG's client retention strategy is the envy of the industry. Everyone knows you're the reason. I hadn't thought about Daniel in years. An idea formed. That afternoon, I met Olivia Grant, the executive recruiter, who had once tried to lure me away from Franklin Consulting Group with a six-figure raise and a corner office. She raised an eyebrow when she saw me walk into the cafe. I never thought I'd see you on this side of the table, she said. Neither did I. Over lattes, I explained what had happened. Olivia listened without interrupting, her expression sharpening with every detail. They made a catastrophic error, she said finally. Client relationships at your level aren't transferable assets. They are personal capital. I'm not looking for another corporate role, I replied. Not after this. Good, she said. Because I don't think that's where you belong anymore. She leaned forward. What if you became the firm? The words lingered between us. Independent consulting. I asked. Not exactly. Strategic relationship management. High-level advisory. You don't work for the firm works through you. I went home that night with my mind racing. By the end of the week, I had drafted a simple proposal, Carter Strategic Relations. No officers. No junior staff. Just me, offering what no traditional firm could, continuity, trust, and institutional memory. Before I could talk myself out of it, I sent the proposal to 3 people. Margaret Sloan. Rebecca Hall. Michael Reed. The responses came faster than I expected. Margaret called first. Name the terms, Helen. Rebecca followed. We've been waiting for someone like you to go independent. Michael's email was short. When do we start? By Friday, I had secured more contracted revenue than Franklin Consulting Group had offered me in severance. Word spread quickly. Within days, my inbox filled with inquiries, executives who had heard, discreetly, that I was available. Meanwhile, inside Franklin Consulting Group, the effects of my departure were becoming visible. Victor Langston struggled to manage accounts he barely understood. Meetings were missed. Details overlooked. Clients began requesting the way Helen used to handle it. One client quietly pulled their retainer. Then another. Edward Franklin called again. Helen, he said carefully, we are bleeding clients. I was sorry to hear that. Victor underestimated what you do, Edward admitted. So did the investors. I didn't respond. We'd like to bring you back as a partner, he continued. Full autonomy. Significant equity. It was everything I had once worked toward. But the moment had passed. I appreciate the offer, Edward. Truly. But I've moved on. After the call ended, I sat quietly, surprised by how little regret I felt. A month later, Daniel Brooks published an article in the Boston Business Review. The Hidden Cost of Cutting Experience: How One Firm's Restructuring Backfired. He never named me directly, but anyone in the industry knew who the senior relationship architect was. Victor Langston resigned 2 weeks after the article ran. Officially, it was to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, investors had lost confidence. Franklin Consulting Group survived, but diminished. Leaner. Less influential. As for me, my days filled again, not with meetings, but with conversations that mattered. I chose my clients carefully. I set boundaries. I worked fewer hours and achieved greater impact. For the first time in my career, I wasn't protecting someone else's brand. I was building my own. And the irony wasn't lost on me. They hadn't eliminated a role. They had unleashed it. Success, I learned, has a way of revealing who truly values you, and who only valued what you produced for them. Within 3 months of launching Carter Strategic Relations, my client list had grown beyond what I had imagined. Each engagement was deliberate, shaped around long-term alignment rather than short-term profit. I wasn't chasing growth. I was curating stability. That distinction mattered. I no longer woke up dreading performance metrics or investor calls. Instead, I started my mornings reviewing strategic updates from Sloan Healthcare, Apex Financial, and Archer Pharma, knowing that my role was advisory, not reactive. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan, Edward Franklin's longtime assistant. Mr. Franklin would like to meet, if you're open to it. I hesitated before replying. Curiosity won. We met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor, neutral ground. Edward looked older. Not weaker, just humbled. I misjudged the balance of power, he said after we sat down. I thought the firm owned the relationships. Many firms make that mistake. Victor convinced us that systems could replace experience, Edward continued. He promised scalability. Scalability without trust is just noise. Edward nodded. Investors are pressuring us to rebuild credibility. They want you involved, even informally. I smiled politely. I'm already involved. Just not with Franklin Consulting Group. The conversation ended cordially, but with an unspoken finality. Later that week, Margaret Sloan invited me to attend a board strategy retreat as a guest advisor. Watching executives debate regulatory risk and growth strategy, I realized something profound. I was no longer an intermediary. I was a peer. After the session, Margaret pulled me aside. You're calmer, she observed. Sharper too. I'm no longer protecting someone else's margins, I replied. News of my independence continued to ripple outward. A senior executive from North Star Capital reached out, asking for guidance on navigating a contentious merger. Another inquiry came from Ridgeway Manufacturing, a former Franklin Consulting Group client struggling with leadership turnover. I accepted some, declined others. Power, I discovered, wasn't in being needed by everyone. It was in choosing where to be indispensable. Meanwhile, Franklin Consulting Group attempted damage control. They hired a team of consultants from Blackridge Consulting to audit client retention failures. The irony didn't escape me. Daniel Brooks followed up his earlier article with a second piece. When efficiency replaces wisdom. This time, Franklin Consulting Group was named directly. Industry sentiment shifted. Younger firms began emphasizing mentorship and continuity. Suddenly, legacy experience was fashionable again. One evening, as I reviewed my schedule for the upcoming quarter, I noticed something that would have been unthinkable before. White space. Entire days unscheduled. I closed my laptop and smiled. That space was intentional. I had spent years telling clients that sustainable growth required breathing room, time to think, not just execute. Now I was finally practicing what I preached. The following month, I was invited to speak at a leadership conference. My topic, the myth of replaceability. On stage, looking out at an audience of executives and partners, I shared my story, carefully anonymized, but unmistakable. Organizations don't fail because they lack talent, I said. They fail because they forget where their value actually lives. Applause followed, genuine, not polite. After the session, a woman approached me, eyes bright. I'm facing something similar, she said. 20 years at my firm, and suddenly I'm too expensive. I handed her my card. They can remove your title, I told her. They can't remove your relationships. As I left the conference hall, phone buzzing with new inquiries, I understood something I hadn't before. My career hadn't peaked. It had recalibrated. And I was only just beginning to enjoy the altitude. Momentum has a quiet sound when it's built on purpose rather than panic. By the end of the year, Carter Strategic Relations had stabilized into something I recognized not as a company, but as an extension of myself. Each engagement reflected my values, discretion, foresight, and respect for institutional knowledge. The work was demanding, but no longer draining. One morning, I received a confidential request from North Star Capital. A major portfolio company was facing internal collapse. Senior leadership was divided, trust fractured, and key executives were threatening to leave. They didn't need another consultant with a slide deck. They needed a translator. I spent 2 days in closed-door sessions, listening more than speaking. By the end, tensions had softened. Not because I offered solutions, but because I reframed the conflict as a shared risk rather than a personal failure. When the engagement ended, the managing director thanked me. You didn't fix the problem, he said. You made it fixable. That became my quiet reputation. Meanwhile, I began mentoring selectively, not formally, but intentionally. Younger professionals reached out, drawn by Daniel Brooks' articles or word of mouth. I met them for coffee, listened to their frustrations, and told them what no firm brochure ever would. Loyalty is reciprocal, or it's not loyalty at all. One of those conversations stayed with me. A junior partner, at a mid-sized firm, confided that leadership had begun documenting her transition risk. They are planning for my exit, she said. Then you should plan for your independence, I replied. Not everyone took that advice immediately. But seeds were planted. Franklin Consulting Group, on the other hand, struggled to regain equilibrium. Edward Franklin stepped back from day-to-day operations, citing health reasons. Investors tightened oversight. The culture shifted, more cautious, less visionary. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The firm hadn't failed because I left. I left because the firm had already failed its values. That distinction mattered. A year after my dismissal, Margaret Sloan invited me to Sloan Healthcare's annual leadership summit, this time as keynote advisor. Standing at the podium, I looked out at faces I knew well, not as accounts, but as people. The greatest risk to any organization, I said, isn't disruption. It's forgetting who holds the trust. Afterward, Margaret hugged me. They underestimated you, she said softly. No, I corrected. They misunderstood ownership. That evening, back home, I opened the manila folder Victor had slid across the table months earlier. The severance agreement was still inside. 2 months' salary. I laughed, not bitterly, but freely. That folder had once represented rejection. Now it felt like seed money. I shredded it. Late that night, an unexpected email arrived. From Linda Moore, former HR director at Franklin Consulting Group. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've resigned. I realized too late that process without conscience is empty. Thank you for showing me another way. I replied simply. You already knew it. You just needed proof. As the year closed, I reviewed my calendar. Fewer clients. Higher impact. Total autonomy. For the first time, my work reflected my worth, not my replaceability. And in the quiet moments, when the world slowed enough to think, I realized something unexpected. Losing my job hadn't been the hardest part. Letting go of who I thought I had to be was. Success has a way of attracting attention, not the loud kind, but the observant kind. 18 months after Carter's strategic relations launched, I received an invitation that surprised even me. The Global Advisory Forum, an annual closed-door summit attended by senior partners, investors, and policy architects, requested my participation. Not as a pain list. As a case study. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades ensuring others were positioned as indispensable, never myself. Now, my departure from Franklin Consulting Group had become a lesson taught in executive circles, a cautionary tale about misjudging relational capital. The session was titled Invisible Assets, When Experience Walks Out the Door. I listened as the moderator summarized my career in 3 minutes, reductive, but accurate enough. Then I was asked a single question. What would you have done differently? I paused before answering. I would have insisted on clarity earlier. Loyalty thrives in transparency, not silence. The room was quiet. Later that evening, a private dinner followed. Around the table sat individuals who shaped industries quietly, people who rarely appeared in headlines, but controlled outcomes. One of them, Richard Vail, leaned toward me. You didn't burn the bridge, he said. You let them set it on fire. I smiled. That distinction matters. Richard was a senior operating partner at Helix Consortium, a holding group known for acquiring distressed professional services firms and rebuilding them around human capital rather than metrics alone. They wanted me on retainer. Not as an executive. As a cultural architect. The role appealed to me, not because of prestige, but because of alignment. Meanwhile, Franklin's internal fractures widened. Through informal channels, I learned that several senior managers had quietly exited. Clients hadn't returned at the rate leadership had promised investors. The firm still existed, but momentum had vanished. Edward Franklin formally retired that quarter. His farewell memo was gracious, but telling. Organizations outlive individuals, he wrote, but values must be intentionally protected. I wondered if he believed that, or wished he had acted on it sooner. One afternoon, while reviewing Helix's onboarding documents, my assistant notified me of a visitor. Daniel Brooks stood in my doorway. Older. Leaner. Less certain. I hadn't seen him since the acquisition announcement. "May I come in?" he asked. Of course. He sat stiffly, eyes scanning the office, the understated design, the lack of excess. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said finally. I waited. "I should have spoken up when Victor moved against you. I knew it was wrong. I told myself it wasn't my fight." "Silence can be a decision," I replied gently. He nodded. "I left Franklin 6 months ago," he continued. "They restructured me out. Funny how that works." I felt no vindication, only resolve. "What will you do next?" I asked. "That's the problem. I don't know who I am outside that firm." I leaned back. "Then you stayed too long." Daniel exhaled, the tension easing slightly. He didn't ask for a job. He asked for perspective. I gave it freely. As he left, I realized something subtle but powerful. Influence doesn't require proximity. It requires integrity. Weeks later, Helix finalized its engagement. My mandate was clear: assess leadership structures, retention risks, and cultural erosion across 3 portfolio firms. Patterns emerged quickly. In each case, experience had been sidelined in favor of perceived efficiency. In each case, trust had thinned. And in each case, the warning signs were ignored until people walked. I documented everything. Not emotionally. Precisely. At the quarterly board review, one director asked bluntly, "Are you saying our problem is arrogance?" I met his gaze. "I'm saying your blind spot is assuming loyalty is automatic." That landed. By year's end, Helix adopted my recommendations firm-wide. Retention stabilized. Engagement scores rose. Revenue followed. Not because processes improved, but because people felt seen again. That winter, Margaret Sloan invited me to dinner. Not business. Personal. We talked about careers, mistakes, and the illusion of permanence. "I thought I was building something lasting," she admitted. "Turns out, I was just renting alignment." That line stayed with me. On my walk home, snow falling lightly, I reflected on how differently my life had unfolded since that meeting in Victor's glass office. I hadn't planned this path. But I had chosen myself when it mattered. And that made all the difference. Closure rarely arrives as a single moment. It comes in layers, quiet confirmations that the decision you made was not only necessary, but right. 2 years after I left Franklin Consulting Group, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at Carter Strategic Relations, watching the city shift into evening. The skyline no longer felt symbolic. It simply felt earned. Helix Consortium had extended my retainer indefinitely. Not because they needed my name. Because they needed my judgment. At their annual leadership retreat, Richard Vail summarized the transformation across their portfolio firms with surgical clarity. "We didn't lose people this year," he said. "We retained wisdom." That distinction mattered. And it validated something I'd known instinctively, but had never articulated: system scale. Relationships endure. One afternoon, an unexpected envelope arrived, handwritten, formal. Edward Franklin. The letter was brief. I underestimated how quietly culture erodes. I mistook stability for strength. "You were right, and I was late." No defense. No justification. Just acknowledgement. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Regret ages faster than courage. Weeks later, the Boston Business Journal published a follow-up piece on the Franklin acquisition. The tone was neutral, almost academic. One sentence stood out: the transition stabilized only after leadership accepted that client trust was relational, not contractual. That was as close to vindication as corporate journalism ever came. Daniel Brooks emailed me that same day. He had started a boutique advisory firm, small, intentional. "I finally understand what you meant," he wrote. "Belonging shouldn't require silence." I smiled. That lesson always costs something. At Carter Strategic Relations, our growth remained deliberate. We turned down more clients than we accepted. Not because we could afford to. Because alignment mattered more than scale. Margaret Sloan joined us as a senior advisor that spring. Her experience added weight, not politics. During one meeting, a junior associate asked her how she'd avoided burnout after decades in the industry. She glanced at me before answering. I stopped mistaking loyalty for obligation. That culture, that permission, spread quietly. No slogans. No branding campaign. Just behavior. One evening, Catherine Winters and I shared dinner overlooking the harbor. The conversation drifted away from contracts and forecasts. "Do you ever miss Franklin?" she asked. I considered it honestly. I miss what it was supposed to be. Not what it became. She nodded, satisfied. The firm thrived under Blackwell's ownership, but it was no longer the axis of my identity. That mattered. Because identity anchored in institutions is fragile. Identity anchored in values is portable. As the years progressed, I noticed something unexpected. People sought me out not for advancement, but for grounding. Executives uncertain about restructuring. Partners navigating succession. Founders facing the slow realization that legacy requires surrender. I never told them what to do. I asked what they were protecting. The answers usually revealed everything. On the 5th anniversary of Carter Strategic Relations, we held a small gathering. No speeches. No press. Just people who believed in the work. As the evening wound down, I stepped outside briefly, letting the cool air settle. I thought back to that conference room, the practiced regret, the manila folder, the escort. I had believed then that I was being removed. In truth, I had been released. Released from waiting for validation. Released from misplaced loyalty. Released into ownership of my own worth. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as revenge. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. The clarity to walk away without bitterness. The clarity to build without resentment. The clarity to understand that when you are treated as replaceable, you are in the wrong room. I didn't collapse Franklin Consulting Group. I simply stopped holding it together. And in doing so, I finally stepped into a life that didn't require my silence to sustain it. That was the real promotion. The one no one could take away.